When you think about it, it seems like e-cigarettes and vaping sort of Trojan horse their way into the consumer marketplace. There's not a lot about it that spells out danger when you take in consideration the white plumes of smoke, fragrances that remind you of your favorite foods, and the instruments themselves look sleek, colorful, and very modern. But do you understand exactly how dangerous vaping can be to one's health? So, I had a conversation with Dr. Jennifer Caudle to get a better understanding of how negatively vaping can be towards one's health. Here's our conversation. I did a little digging. I didn't do full-blown research, but here's what was interesting to me, that there was a patent in the 1930s for an e-cigarette. Were you aware of that?
I wasn't. I am not, rather. Wow.
I forget the gentleman's name, but apparently this guy was ahead of his time. And then what
Clearly.
was a little bit jarring, and I got this from the BBC, is that vaping industry is a $19 billion industry right now.
Yes. Yes.
There are more than 2,000 cases of lung injury, almost 40 deaths per the CDC. And one thing that's interesting to me, but also troubling, is the level of sophistication these manufacturers and these vaping companies use to engage the consumer or the vapors or smokers or whatever you call them with the different aromas, the optics of the pull.
Yeah.
I feel like, it's very intelligent and very smart marketing to engage them, but I wonder how, I guess, aware people are of the danger. So, like, as a healthcare professional, what concerns you most about this whole phenomena of vaping?
What concerns me most about vaping, and by the way, it's concerned me for years. I've been writing op-eds. I wrote some op-eds in CNN.com opinion back in, I think, 2015 even. I've been writing op-eds about this for years. I've been talking about it on the news for years. And my concerns are a few. The first one is that, and this is aside from the vaping related lung illnesses that we're seeing now, but even before all of that, e-cigarettes at their basicness, one of the problems is they've never been regulated very tightly, if at all, at some times. There's a lot we don't know about e-cigarettes, vaping, and the long-term effects. We don't really know much about long-term effects, if there are any, what they may be, et cetera. That's a big concern for me. It's also a concern for me, the fact that there's a lot of ingredients in these e-cigarettes, like the vaping liquid, that we don't actually necessarily know what's in them. There's a lot of stuff. We know there's often nicotine and sometimes THC and other things. But the point being is we don't always have a handle on what's in them. And not only that, but again, what these sort of ingredients can cause down the line and for years going on. That's always been my concern. Before even kids started picking up vaping, that was my concern. Now, what's happened in the last few years is that, as you mentioned, vaping has become popularized, and not just among adults, but among kids who they're not even indicated for. Vaping and e-cigarettes are not indicated for anyone under the age of 18. But what's happened is there's bubblegum flavor, there's Captain Crunch flavor, there's mango, there's peach, there's marshmallow. That, along with advertising and all sorts of other things, has really created this whole new wave. It's an epidemic, essentially, of young people that are hooked on e-cigarettes. And what that means is that they're kids that are addicted to nicotine, sometimes at 13, 14, 15 years old. That is also my concern. Those two things have always been big concerns. And then, of course, now as we move into the vaping illnesses, which I know we'll talk about, but those two things, scary, absolutely scary.
So, yeah, that's very interesting, because if you don't have regulation, then there's this big area of risk for these manufacturers and these companies to continuously introduce whatever ingredients and whatever additives, and I just don't know how that's being accounted for. Do you see many patients that are vape users?
I do. it doesn't necessarily come up unless I'm specifically asking about tobacco use or smoking or things like that. It's interesting, when I was in med school, we were taught to, how to ask patients questions. And a big part of what you ask patients is the social history. Okay, do you drink? How much? Do you smoke? Do you use illicit drugs? Now, it's funny, the question, do you smoke, over the last 10, 15 years, I've realized I've had to clarify that. Do you smoke? Some people refer to that as using marijuana. Some people are thinking about smoking cigarettes. Some people are referring to vaping. So I actually now have to say, do you vape? Do you use e-cigarettes? Do you smoke marijuana? What do you use in your e-cigarettes? Do you smoke tobacco? Combustible cigarettes. So to answer your question, I do see it. There are a lot of people that vape, but yeah, as doctors, we also need to make sure that we're savvy and asking all the right questions, because we can't assume anymore.
So with some of the, I guess, medical issues a person could have with it, besides having difficulties or complications with one's lungs, I guess the respiratory system, what other kind of harmful effects can this cause?
So when we're talking about, e-cigarettes, and we're talking about sort of the nicotine-based e-cigarettes, and again, I keep clarifying that I'm not speaking about the EVALI, which is the e-cigarette or vaping associated lung illnesses. That's the acronym that we're now using for the many cases of lung illnesses that we're seeing throughout the country, people being hospitalized. So I want to clarify that. What are some of the side effects or health consequences of e-cigarettes? Well, I'll be honest with you, a lot of them we don't necessarily know. What I do know as a physician is I don't want anyone inhaling anything into the lungs, right? The potential for cancer is one, no matter what you're smoking and how you're smoking it. That potential is something I'm always concerned about. But how that risk stacks up to combustible cigarettes versus other things, I don't know that we actually have the answers to those questions. I think it's one of the toughest parts about this is that there's just as many questions, if not more, than actual answers that we have.
At the risk of asking another question that we don't
Sure.
have data on, well, I guess with one of the benefits of tobacco use or smoking being around for a long time, we have a sense of what's considered heavy use, like 1 pack a day versus a half a pack a day. Do we have any idea of what's considered a lot of vaping?
Yeah, that's a really great question, is how do we quantify vaping, right? And establish what's a lot versus a little. And you're right that with traditional cigarettes, obviously somebody that smokes 3 packs a day is that's very different than someone who smokes a half pack per day. I think there are still questions, not to sound like a broken record, but I do have more to add about this. Yes, there's still questions about really how to quantify this. I think some of it comes in the loose sort of regulations around e-cigarettes. I don't know that they're not necessarily all the same. I think is something that we have to understand, is that not every brand, not every package has the same quantities of the same stuff necessarily. And that's one of the variables that makes it difficult, right? And one of the reasons why regulation and more regulation is going to be very important. But even nicotine amounts, there have been, I've seen stories on television, on the news, and documentaries and features that talk about how sometimes, the nicotine containing in vaping and the e-liquids can be a lot more than what one might get from a traditional cigarette. But again, that can vary. So there's, again, a lot that we don't know, but this also underscores the reason why we need these answers. We need to understand. And, and maybe this is a question you were going to ask, but a lot of people, and I'll be very honest with you, every time I do a segment on vaping or I talk about this in the news, there are many people who kind of come at me saying, almost angrily, hey, look, you're talking so badly about e-cigarettes, but would you prefer me smoke regular cigarettes? Is that what you want? No. And I know that you laugh at it, and I get it, right? But I want to respect the question, and I want to pose that because there are a lot of people, at least that come to me with responses and comments on my YouTube videos, fair enough, saying, well, so what is it that you want me to do? Because e-cigarettes are supposed to be safer than regular cigarettes. I can imagine you don't want me to go back to smoking. And that's just an example, right? And what I'll say to that is this: you're right. I don't want you smoking traditional cigarettes. I do not. We know that cigarette smoking is the main risk factor for lung cancer among so many other conditions, right? I don't want you smoking regular cigarettes. And e-cigarettes, we have traditionally thought of as being safer than combustible cigarettes. That is something that is well documented in the literature. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that just because it might be safer doesn't mean that it's safe. And that's the fine line, okay? So my preference for those who vape out there, traditional e-cigarettes, nicotine e-cigarettes, et cetera, my hope is that you neither smoke combustible cigarettes nor vape. Now, what I do say is that if you've used e-cigarettes to quit smoking traditional cigarettes, and you also quit using e-cigarettes, like you were able to use them to quit cigarettes and you quit everything, rock on. I'm thrilled, right? Because that would be ideal. But what ultimately happens sometimes is that people not only smoke e-cigarettes, but they smoke traditional combustible cigarettes, or they just keep vaping without smoking combustible cigarettes. And that's not my preference. That I don't want you to do. Okay. And remember, just because it's traditionally been thought of as safer doesn't mean that it's safe.
I think that's a very easy thing for people to make a false equivalence on. Just because it's not product A, then therefore it's considerably safer. And I think, again, in a way, you have to respect the marketing and the product design from these companies to, just shiny, the colorful instruments that they use. I, in my opinion, and I'm not a smoker, I think it really softens the lethality or the negative image of it. Let's talk about the youths. This is by far probably what bothers me the most, is seeing, and anywhere in the world that I go, I see young people with the big plumes of smoke. Maybe a better question is, what are some of the health risks that young adults are not aware of?
Well, I think that you really kind of hit the nail on the head. I think for a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of young people, I've done segments on this. I did a segment on the Tamron Hall show, I guess it was a month or two ago, and some other segments. And notoriously, people that, at least that I've come in contact with, young people have often said, well, I didn't think it was a big deal. I thought it was safe. I thought it was okay to do. And I can kind of understand maybe how people might assume that it's something safe and not a big deal. But the truth of the matter is, it's not necessarily safe. In fact, I don't think it's safe at all. We know, first of all, for young people, e-cigarettes are not indicated at all. Young people should not be using e-cigarettes. Remember, e-cigarettes have nicotine in them. Nicotine is a tobacco byproduct. And one of the things from a health standpoint is we don't necessarily know all the ways that nicotine affects the developing brain. It's a concern. There are stories that I've seen about kids being hooked on vaping, and they're literally addicted to nicotine, where they start getting withdrawal symptoms if they don't vape at a certain period of time, because that's what nicotine does. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances that we have out there. And kids are not necessarily immune to that. With that, though, is that this nicotine is acting on the brain, and we think it affects attention and concentration and other things. But the full effects of how nicotine affects the developing brain, we just don't know. Remembering also that e-cigarettes and vaping liquids are not the best regulated, and there might be varying amounts of nicotine in them. You may not even realize how much nicotine you're getting. So that's one thing, is how it's affecting brain development. The other thing is that there are some other medical conditions that can just be affected by inhaling something or smoking something, right? Things like asthma, okay? Things like allergies. Those are conditions that really can be made worse, not necessarily allergies per se, but allergies as it plays into asthma. But those people who are asthmatics, smoking is not going to help you. I can promise you that. That's not going to help you. And there may be other people with underlying conditions as well, other underlying conditions that it makes worse. But I think the overriding issue, and those aren't the only things, but the other issue is what we talked about before, is that there's so many things in these e-cigarette vape liquids, we just don't entirely know exactly how they function, what consequences they'll have down the line. And there's just a lot we don't know because we don't have a lot of studies about them, and it's not the most regulated. So I would say that the health consequences are particularly strong and severe potentially. And for kids out there, e-cigarettes are not harmless. They're not. They're not indicated for kids. They're not indicated for pregnant women. They're not indicated for some other people with certain conditions. So keep that in mind. It's not that they're just harmless. That's not the case.
I think, and I can say I was guilty of this as a younger man. Maybe it's a combination of youthful arrogance and a certain level of ignorance. And it's like another thing to consider is that not only are you vaping, but it's also potentially the air you're inhaling in whatever environment you're in. I don't know, it's a bit scary. What about, can we talk a little bit about some of these contaminants that are making their way into e-cigarettes and vaping instruments?
Yeah. So you're talking about, are you thinking about like the vitamin E stuff that we've recently heard about in the news?
Yeah,
Is that what you're
that
thinking about?
and
Yeah.
some of the stuff. Like I have a coworker that vapes, and I was like, "Dude, you got to stop." And he said, "Well, it's not the safe stuff. It's the stuff people buy off the street with these illicit contaminants and whatever."
So, all right. So I'm so glad that you kind of told that story because literally up until last night, and by the way, today, what day of the week is today? Is it Thursday?
Thursday.
Thank you. So the CDC actually on once a week has been coming out with, they've activated sort of their high alert system where they're tracking this very closely, and every week they're having updates. So they should have an update today. This is what I would say. Now, let's talk a little bit about, and interrupt me, I mean, because this might be a very long answer to your
No, no,
question, but
no.
I
Go
want to
ahead.
make sure, okay, I want to make sure that I give the background to kind of set this up. Around August, July, we started seeing people becoming very, very ill, coming to the hospital with symptoms like shortness of breath, cough, trouble breathing. They had maybe nausea, vomiting, some diarrhea, but just like super sick. And they're people who don't normally get sick or shouldn't be that sick, right? Maybe no underlying conditions, maybe young, healthy people, but they're coming to the hospital, and all of a sudden they were coming to the hospital and not able to go home and stay home. They would come back to the hospital and end up on ventilators, et cetera, admitted to the hospital and be in for days. And we started seeing that. I did my first segment on the e-cigarette vaping associated lung illnesses. We didn't have that name for it then. We just knew that these people who were vaping were getting sick. I did my first segment on that back in August. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what's going on? And obviously this is like my worst fear and the worst fear of everyone, because we have no idea. And we still have a lot to learn. So that started a few months ago. And as we know, it's just increased. There have been more and more and more cases of people getting deathly ill, people dying from sort of the consequences of this. And one of the things that they have pretty much all had in common is some sort of vaping. Most of the people that have been hospitalized have vaped THC. Some of them did not report vaping THC. Some just only had nicotine, but the vast majority of them had been vaping THC. Okay. So then that brings me to what your coworker said regarding contaminants and which products are safe and which are not. Well, last week, and I guess I should say on one of the CDC broadcasts, recently talked about vitamin E acetate as being a contaminant that has been found in lung samples from a number of the cases of people that have been, that have become ill with this condition. Vitamin E acetate, people say, well, vitamin E, what's the big deal with vitamin E? I mean, that sounds healthy. I mean, I take a vitamin E supplement in the morning, and I have my vitamin E face cream that I use and my lotion that I use. And, people are right. You're exactly right. The thing about vitamin E is it's perfectly safe in other forms of delivery. If you're taking it via a supplement, like by a pill, totally fine. You're slathering it on your skin, a vitamin E cream, right? How many lotions don't have vitamin E in them, right? That's totally fine. But the difference is if you inhale vitamin E, that's what you can't be doing. And that's why, once again, that's why medicine and health is so fascinating, but it's also why we have to be judicious. We can't make assumptions, right? The assumptions that people make about vaping, oh, it must be safer. Oh, it must be fine because I didn't buy it off the street. There's so many things that we just don't know and things that we've discovered. So anyway, vitamin E acetate was found in the lung samples of many people who got sick, who've been sick. And that's sort of like the first big clue that we've had. Now, by the way, back in September, I remember the CDC actually mentioning vitamin E acetate, that they were suspicious about it. But now they have almost like a direct link. So what does this mean, you say? Well, it means that we've found a probable cause for many of these illnesses, but it doesn't say that this is the only cause. It doesn't say that we're not going to find additional causes. It doesn't say there's nothing else going on. It's just that this, we do think, is a probable contributor / cause to what we're seeing. But the investigation is by no means over. Now, if I can keep going for just a second, and like I said, stop me if this is okay.
No, no, no.
So,
I want you to go. Keep going.
okay. So then people may say, well, then, oh, okay, then I'm good. It's just people who, oh, and by the way, the vitamin E was found in people, the lung samples, and the majority of those had smoked THC. Okay. So they reported THC use. Some also had nicotine in their lungs, but mostly THC. So that might lead someone to say, oh, well, if I don't vape THC, I'm good. And if I buy it from the legit places, I'm good. Well, let's back up for just a second. Okay. So the CDC has acknowledged the connection between vaping THC products and this vitamin E acetate contaminant, to the point where the CDC actually says, number one, don't vape THC. They say this on their website. They say, number two, don't buy your vape products or your vape supplies or vape THC, nicotine, anything off of the street, because they think that that may be some of what's going on, that the supply is being contaminated from sort of unregulated sort of means and sources. They also say, don't augment your own vape liquid with stuff trying to make it last longer or whatever, okay? Because they're concerned that may be going on as well. But this is the thing, okay? Just because you don't buy THC off the street doesn't mean that you're not necessarily at risk. I actually took a look last night at, New Jersey. We have medical marijuana, okay? For example, it's legal here. And some states it's legal, right? And so there are dispensaries, perfectly legal, right? People go and get their medical marijuana for their medical conditions. And I just went online last night to take a look at what's out there. And I found a number of New Jersey dispensaries that on their website say that actually provide vape pens or sell vape pens to their customers, along with recommending vaping THC. And I also saw many of them say, well, ours don't contain vitamin E acetate. Okay.
Hmm.
Good news. But the CDC actually in their website and in the press conference they had last week actually says, look, there's still a lot of investigating going on, and dispensaries are probably in the throes of figuring out what actually is in their products. It's not to say they have vitamin E acetate, but to say definitively that if you get your vape pen from XYZ, you will be safe. I'm not sure that we can say that 100%. That's just a long-winded way to say, I don't know that we can say that 100%, which is also why the CDC and myself says, look, if you're concerned about this, don't vape at all until we know what's going on. Yeah.
I'm glad the CDC is really involved in that.
Yeah.
It sounds like what you described is that the vaping industry is mirroring a version of what the food industry does. Is people are consuming certain groups of foods, and then people have problems with gluten. So what do some companies do? They pivot off that and say, oh, well, we're removing gluten. We're making our food gluten-free. So it sounds like some form of that, where these companies identify the vitamin E as being harmful, and then now they're openly broadcasting like, hey, we don't have vitamin E.
Yeah, I'm not, well, I don't know, maybe I don't understand your question or exactly what you were saying with the gluten example. The impression I got from the New Jersey dispensaries that I was looking at was that
Mhm.
the language sort of read like they wanted their customers to be reassured that their product didn't contain that. So, I'm not implying that they had vitamin E in them and then they started taking it out. That's not what I'm implying.
Oh, no, 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 no. That's exactly what I was getting
Yeah,
at. It's a
yeah,
reassurance that,
yeah,
hey, this product doesn't contain vitamin E,
yeah,
this substance that can hurt you. By the
yeah.
way, it's safe to buy it from us.
Right. And that's literally what I saw on some websites. Absolutely.
And can we kind of take a step back and kind of clarify the range of symptoms from a little cough to whatever the extreme case can be?
So the symptoms again, and I think it can be pretty difficult sometime this time of year because we're in cold and flu season. And the symptoms of this sort of e-cigarette vaping associated lung injury or illness is often people have shortness of breath, they have cough. They also may have some GI symptoms, that's maybe nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea, things like that, but they just become really ill. And once again, I think, again, like I said, now that we're in cold and flu season, it could be difficult to sort of distinguish who may be coming down with a cold versus who may be sort of acquiring this illness.
And I read something that was interesting. And again, this is from the CDC. They in their language on their website, recommend that adults who use e-cigarettes or vaping not return to nicotine products. I'm assuming cigarettes or
Yeah,
tobacco. I don't
right.
understand, like it makes sense, but I guess on a deeper level, I don't understand the medical rationale behind that.
So I think my feeling when I've read that statement is that I think the CDC may be trying to tell people, okay, we don't necessarily want you vaping, but it's also perhaps a way to say we don't want you smoking cigarettes though either. Okay, and I think that's what they're trying to get across is, you know, just because we're telling you not to buy vape products off the street, not to smoke THC, to avoid all vaping if you're concerned, et cetera, just because we're saying those things doesn't mean that it's okay to go back to cigarettes, which I think is a reasonable thing to reinforce. And I think it also opens up the dialogue for patients and doctors and to have conversations about, okay, so how do we help you quit smoking? You know, it kind of helps us revisit that conversation.
What kind of government involvement in safe practices from the manufacturers would help keep people safe from your point of view, and then secondarily make it, I don't know, I guess make the jobs of healthcare professionals like yourself easier?
Well, I just think that, and I'm not exactly sure of exactly how things are regulated by the FDA, right? I know that there is a process and they've got their whole deal. But I
Mhm.
guess what I'm asking for is that that whole deal be applied to e-cigarettes. That's what I'm asking for. That's what I think should happen. They need to be fully regulated. Now, there have been steps to expand regulations over the years. There have been baby steps that have been made that I want to acknowledge, I don't want to ignore, and I want to give credit for, because I think that's very, very important. But they need to be regulated. People are buying these things made off the internet and wherever place they are, and they're smoking them and inhaling this liquid into their lungs. We need to have a good sense of what actually is going on. So I think that's my answer to your first question. Remind me what your second question
I
was.
guess if I'm looking at it from a point of view is if there was some reasonable level of regulations, then perhaps as a healthcare professional, you can narrow your focus on
Oh,
a certain set of variables to treat the patient
sure.
versus
Yes.
this swashbuckling type of, you know, uh, ecosystem where it's just
Yeah.
really hard to narrow down on how to treat and educate everyone.
I think that's a really excellent point. That's one of the benefits of regulation. There are many, many benefits. Benefits of regulation include making sure everything's standardized and we know what's in these products. That also allows us to test them to know what happens long term when people use these products over time, so we can make informed decisions. But also, to your point, if things are regulated better, it helps us, the medical community, understand what we're dealing with and what we're not. One of the problems with this e-cigarette vaping associated lung illness is that it's the wild, wild west. Nobody knows. We're like, do you vape? What do you vape? Where'd you get it? What's in it? How often do you use it? We don't know. We're literally putting building blocks to being like, okay, well, these people did this. Okay, well, these people did this. We're literally having to put this together block by block. It's literally an investigation, because it's anyone's guest. It's anyone's game. So you're right that it will help the medical community, and ultimately it's going to help people who vape. I'm not, my thing is, well, I don't want to necessarily go down that road, but vaping would be a lot easier for me to swallow if there were a lot more answers that we had to questions. And I'm not saying I would approve of it. I don't want anyone smoking anything, but it makes it even harder that there's so much that we just don't know.
Is the quality of data being collected at the state level and at the federal level
I think
helping?
it I think it is. I think we're now collecting more data. I think we are collecting data now. I'm not
Mm.
saying that we weren't before, but especially with these lung illnesses, this is like a nationwide kind of thing. So this is sort of a reportable condition, and it's caused us to really hone in and get more data. I can't speak exactly to what type of data reporting we had before. We've known how many people roughly. We've had an idea of how many kids vaping has skyrocketed among, and how many adults, et cetera, but I'm not sure the extent of data that we had before. But I do know that we are collecting data now, which is a good thing.
Are we sharing data in the international community to kind of get a sense of what their findings are?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I've certainly seen reports about vaping and vaping e-cigarette use in the UK, which from my impression seems to be actually very different than what it is here. Again, those are my brief impressions from a couple of CNN specials that I saw. I'm by no means an expert or can speak about vaping in other countries, but I would hope that we share information, share knowledge, and that this be used to sort of further our general body of knowledge for the whole world. Quite honestly.
If by chance, and I know how stubborn people can be, and I'm one of them, I'm one of them, but if people were curious about educating themselves more on the subject, whether they're a parent who has a kid that vapes or whether there's somebody who's been vaping for quite some time, where would we point these people to get information?
Yeah. I say go to the cdc.gov. cdc.gov. Literally, when you open up the homepage, it's like plaster all on the homepage, the vaping sort of epidemic that we're in. You click on it, and it really kind of goes through the best evidence that we have up to date. It's updated very, very frequently. And like I said, they're doing press conferences right now, I think about weekly, with updates, any updates that we may have. Very, very important. You can also go to fda.gov. The FDA also has a lot of information about vaping and things like that. And it's related to the CDC. That's your main source of information because that's who's doing the investigation. That's where that's who's gathering this data from the patients in the hospitals and the illnesses and the deaths and things like that. That's where you want to go. Absolutely.
Okay.
Actually, I did want to mention something else
Sure, go
about
ahead.
how, if it's okay, because I think that again, what I don't want people to say is, okay, well, you don't want me to vape. Well, what am I supposed to do? I
Mhm.
don't want people to feel like they need to go back to cigarettes. And I want to remind folks out there that there are wonderful and FDA approved ways of quitting smoking. By the way, vaping is not an FDA approved smoking cessation method, by the way. So there are FDA approved methods, whether it's nicotine replacement, nicotine gum, patches, etc. There's also two medications that are pill form that are approved for smoking cessation. I guess what I want to encourage people out there is I don't want you to watch this and feel like you're hopeless and there's nothing for you to do and no hope for you. This may be the time to have a conversation with your doctor and we can help you find the right options for you. By the way, I've had a couple patients that have done hypnotherapy. They've done literally hypnotherapy for their smoking cessation, and hypnotists can work very well with some patients. New Jersey, for example, along with other states, has a toll-free quit line. It's called, I think, 1-800 New Jersey Quit, where you can call and get counseling. So there's a lot of resources. I just want people to know that, the point is to keep us all safe. And that means on the e-cigarette side, but also on the cigarette side as well.
Well, one thing I forgot to ask you, like, what I guess I'm trying to get at, what should a vape or e-cigarette user be alarmed by? Like, what should trigger them to say,
Yes.
I have to go to the doctor right now?
Gotcha. Okay, so this is what I would say. If you get sick, and this is going to sound very, very vague, but this is kind of all we have right now. If you get sick and either you're not getting better, you're getting worse, or it's a type of sickness that you've never had before, and you're like, what is this? Get checked out. Don't take any chances, honestly, because we know that this is affecting people in a different way than probably pretty much anything else we've ever seen before. And honestly, I would say too, is it's always better for you to come in and get checked out and have it be nothing than to not and suffer and struggle at home or elsewhere.
Yeah, one of the things I kind of harp on is for us guys, we're socialized to,
Yeah.
oh, like, work through it, fight through it, you'll be okay in
Tough,
the
tough
morning.
through it.
Yeah, yeah, and like 3 days or a week later, they're still sick. So, fellas, if any of you are listening, I would say hedge your bet, be safe. Better be safe than sorry. Anything else you want to share about this, Jen?
No, nothing about this. No.
What's coming up next for you?
Oh, yeah. So I'm actually getting ready to do a TV segment in about an hour. So I'll be, so that's coming up. I encourage people to follow me on social. just because I post a lot of the TV segments I do. I do a lot of television segments on, I know you did an introduction, so I won't go through all that. But I'm on social at Dr. Jen Caudle, and that's where I am on Instagram, on Facebook, and Twitter. I'm on YouTube as well at Dr. Jen Caudle, where I have a fan base of about over 17,500 or so YouTube followers, which I'm so grateful for. So I'd love if you join me. I post all my segments there, which is very important to me. And I have a free health newsletter that I actually just started in the last couple of months. You can subscribe to the newsletter. Comes out every 2 weeks. You can subscribe at drjencaudle.com.
Okay. Well, I mean, I enjoyed this, and anytime you'd ever like to come back and share information, I'd be
absolutely
happy to have you.
Thank you. You're a great host, I must say. I love the whole, you're a pro. I'm impressed.
Well, thanks. I'm trying to get better. And my whole mission, or one of my missions, is helping people, simplifying the complicated, and helping people understand the world and understand themselves a bit better.
Yeah. No, I think it's awesome. I think you're doing really great work, and it's nice to actually talk to you in person. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, put a face to the voice.
I know. It's really nice. So it's nice to meet you.
You as well. I hope to talk to you soon. And
absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jen. From LA, we say thanks and have a good day, and good luck on your segment.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.